The date was September 30th, 1943. Inside Imperial General Headquarters in Tokyo, a policy document was ratified that the men in that room took as the final word on the war's geography. The formal language described a zone that ran east through the Marshall Islands, south through the Carolines, westward across the northern approaches to New Guinea, and back north through the Kuriles to the home islands. Everything inside this boundary was called the Absolute National Defense Zone. The phrase was not rhetorical. It was an operational commitment, backed by garrisons and aircraft and warships that had been positioned at the key points along the arc, built around a single calculation. If the zone held, the factories and shipyards and rail networks that kept Japan fighting would be beyond the reach of American air power. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo understood what his government had committed to. He said so publicly, in terms that left no room for retreat. He told the Japanese people, in a statement that the post-war record has preserved without ambiguity, that the United States would never take Saipan. The Marianas chain, of which Saipan was the largest and most developed island, sat the geographic center of the inner ring, 1,400 miles south of Tokyo, at the precise distance from Japan that made the chain dangerous to hold and catastrophic to lose. Tojo knew what the map showed. He staked his government on the proposition that the line would hold. He resigned from office on July 18, 1944, 9 days after Saipan fell. What came next, from the flat coral plateaus of that island and from the adjacent islands of Tinian and Guam, was not simply a bombing campaign. It was the physical demonstration that every assumption embedded in the absolute national defense zone had been miscalculated. The story of how the Americans got those islands, what they built on them in months that veterans of the construction later called a miracle, and what flew from them into the darkness over Japan, is the story of a strategic miscalculation that no staff assessment in the autumn of 1943 had the evidence to fully correct, because the evidence did not yet exist. If this story is pulling you in, take a second to hit the like button and subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. It means a great deal to know who's listening. To understand why the zone failed as completely as it did, and why it failed in the specific form it took, you have to begin with what reaching Japan from the air actually required before the B-29 Superfortress existed in operational form, and with the distance between American strategic ambition and the geography that made that ambition look, through most of 1942, like a wish rather than a plan. The Pacific War began for American air power with a catastrophe at Clark Field in the Philippines. On the morning of December 8, 1941, hours after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese bombers and fighters caught the American B-17 flying fortresses on the ground despite warning enough that the aircraft might have been moved to safety. The reasons they were not moved have never been fully explained. What is beyond dispute is the result. The aircraft that pre-war planners had positioned in the Philippines as a deterrent to Japanese southward expansion burned in their revetments. What survived scattered toward Australia. From the moment the smoke cleared, American air power in the Pacific had no base from which to operate within meaningful range of Japan's home islands. The men who understood strategic bombing and its potential against Japan faced a problem that could be stated simply. Japan's industrial cities, the facilities that produced the steel and the aircraft engines and the ships and the artillery shells that kept the empire fighting, sat on the home islands. Tokyo, Nagoya, Osaka, Kobe, Yokohama. Reaching any of them from a friendly base required crossing a distance no existing American bomber could cover with a useful bomb load and enough fuel to return. The nearest point of even marginal utility was China, and China presented its own version of the same problem at a different scale. Supply routes into China ran through the Himalayan air corridor that cargo pilots called the Hump, an air passage above mountains that rose to over 20,000 feet, subject to storms that swallowed aircraft without leaving wreckage, maintained only by the crews of transport planes who flew it daily at risk, an expense that the ledgers of the China-Burma-India theater recorded in losses of men and aircraft and fuel that would have sustained a division-sized force anywhere else. General Henry Arnold commanded Army Air Forces in Washington, and Arnold's central preoccupation from the first weeks of the war was a bomber that did not yet exist in combat-ready form. The program that became the B-29 Superfortress had been developing at Boeing since 1939, shaped by a requirement that the Army Air Forces had written against the possibility of precisely the situation it now faced. The requirement called for a pressurized aircraft capable of carrying up to 20,000 pounds of ordnance, operating above 30,000 feet, and flying distances that would exceed 3,000 miles in certain configurations. Meeting those requirements pushed every material and manufacturing system in American industry to its wartime limit. The B-29 killed test pilots and engineers during development at a rate that the program managers reported upward in language their superiors found alarming. It ran behind schedule for reasons that were sometimes technical and sometimes administrative and sometimes both, and demanded engineering solutions that had never been attempted on a production aircraft. Arnold drove the program with an intensity that his staff found at times impossible to accommodate, because he understood that without the B-29 and a base within its range of Japan, the Pacific War had no strategic air campaign to speak of. The total program cost, across development and production, eventually reached approximately $3 billion in wartime appropriations, a figure that the post-war accounting showed exceeded the cost of the Manhattan Project. The first American demonstration that Japan could be struck from the air came before the B-29 existed in deployable form. On April 18, 1942, Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle led 16 B-25 Mitchell medium bombers off the flight deck of the carrier Hornet and struck Tokyo and 4 other Japanese cities. The raid destroyed almost nothing of military consequence. It produced fires that Japanese fire departments contained quickly. What it demonstrated, at a moment when the American public needed demonstration and the Japanese military needed to respond to it, was that the home islands were not beyond reach. The Japanese reaction was not dismissive. Fighter squadrons were redirected to home defense. The planning for a further eastward advance, toward Midway, meant to push the carrier threat away from the home islands, was accelerated, and that advance ended in June in the destruction of 4 Japanese fleet carriers and the experienced aviators who flew from them. The raid could not be repeated systematically. It required a carrier within the operational radius of Japan's coast, and used aircraft on a one-way mission to Chinese bases that were themselves barely functional. It was a demonstration, not a strategy, and the distinction mattered enormously. Touching Japan once from a carrier deck at extreme risk proved a proposition. Reaching Japan regularly from a permanent base with aircraft in sufficient numbers to matter was a different problem entirely. When the B-29 became available in small numbers in the first half of 1944, the Army Air Forces attempted to use it against Japan from bases in the Chengdu region of China. The operation, known as Matterhorn, ran immediately into the logistics problem that the Hump route imposed. 5 to 6 gallons of aviation fuel were consumed in transport aircraft for every gallon that arrived at the Chengdu bases. The bomber stream that finally flew from those bases carried ordnance across to Japan in numbers that the Japanese could note and assess as a real threat, but not in the tonnage that a functional strategic campaign required. A bombing campaign that burned more in its own supply chain than it delivered to the aircraft doing the bombing could not be sustained at any operational tempo the Japanese industrial system would notice. The B-29s flew from Chengdu. They hit targets in Manchuria and in Japan itself on a handful of occasions, including the Yada steel complex and rail targets in other parts of the empire. The damage assessments were not encouraging, and the sortie rate was not something that distinguished the campaign from a series of demonstrations. What Matterhorn established was proof of concept. The B-29 could reach Japan and return. The range figures were real. The aircraft could function at the altitudes and distances for which it had been designed. What could not do from China was function at the scale a strategic bombing campaign required, because the Hump logistics problem had no solution that American engineering could build fast enough to matter in the context of the war's timeline. The solution to the logistics problem was not an aircraft modification or a new approach to the Himalayas. The solution was geography, specifically the geography of the Mariana Islands. The chain ran north to south through the Central Pacific, 1,400 miles south of Tokyo, across open ocean that American naval power had controlled since the summer of 1942. Fuel and bombs and spare parts and replacement aircraft, and the full logistical apparatus of a large air operation could reach the Marianas by ship from Pearl Harbor at a cost in fuel and time that bore no resemblance to the Hump. The geometry placed every major Japanese industrial city within the B-29's practical combat range. Japan held the islands. The Japanese had administered the Marianas since 1914 under a League of Nations mandate that followed Germany's defeat. Saipan was developed over 3 decades of Japanese administration into a productive territorial possession with a civilian population of Japanese settlers and indigenous Chamorros, agricultural land, and military facilities built up in the years before the war. Tinian, across a 3-mile channel, had flat northern plateaus that were essentially ready-made airfield terrain in a form that no planner could have designed better. Guam, the southernmost of the main islands, had been American territory until the Japanese seized it in the war's opening days. The chain sat at the precise distance from Japan that made it dangerous in American hands, and the men who wrote the absolute national defense zone in a Japanese strategic policy in September 1943 understood that danger and designed the zone's inner ring explicitly to prevent it from being realized. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, who had commanded the carrier force at Pearl Harbor and had led Japanese carrier aviation through its first terrible years of accumulating losses, was sent to Saipan to oversee the defense of the island. On June 14, 1944, the day before the American landing force arrived, Nagumo wrote a message that the post-war record preserved. He wrote that the Marianas were the first line of defense of the homeland, and that it was a certainty the Americans would land that month or the next. He was not wrong about the certainty. The landing force was already at sea, less than a day away from his beaches. The calculation inside Imperial General Headquarters had held that the cost of taking the Marianas would exceed what the Americans were willing to pay. Tarawa in November 1943 had cost the Americans over 1,000 killed in 76 hours on an island barely 2 miles long. Each successive operation through the Gilberts and the Marshalls had extracted a price in blood and time and material that the Japanese planners read as evidence that the attrition was working. What the planners were reading was the evidence from the operations as they had been conducted up to that point, and they were applying it to projections that assumed the Americans would continue at the same scale and with the same methods. The Americans were not going to do that. The force that Vice Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner's amphibious command and General Holland Smith's troops brought to Saipan on June 15, 1944, was the product of 2.5 years of mobilization that had been specifically organized to make the Marianas campaign survivable at the cost it would require. 535 ships, over 127,000 assault troops, a fast carrier covering force of 15 carriers with more than 900 aircraft embarked. Behind all of it, a logistics chain of sufficient depth to absorb whatever losses the defense could impose without interrupting the operation's forward momentum. The battle lasted until July 9th. General Yoshitsu Saito commanded the Japanese garrison of roughly 32,000 men, and his troops fought with the totality of commitment the Imperial Army demanded of its island defenders. The terrain of Saipan's interior, coral ridges and sugarcane fields and caves that the garrison had turned into fortified positions over years of preparation, forced the American advance to hard daily gains measured in hundreds of yards. The heat in those weeks was extreme. Japanese artillery fired from prepared positions, registered on the ground the Americans had to cross. Counterattacks came at night against positions the defending infantry had spent the day taking. American casualties over 3 weeks reached roughly 14,000 killed and wounded across the 3 divisions committed to the fight. The island fell regardless. The garrison was not pushed back or neutralized. It was consumed. The fighting in Saipan's interior proceeded through terrain that had been prepared over years for exactly the defense that now had to be beaten. The ridgeline complexes of the island's center, places with names like Death Valley and Purple Heart Ridge that appeared on no pre-war map, held Japanese infantry, who had ranged the approaches with artillery and mortars and machine guns, positioned to create interlocking fields of fire across every route of advance. Each cave that the garrison had fortified required individual reduction. Flamethrowers and demolition teams worked the approaches under direct fire. The ammunition expenditure ran to figures the logistics planners had considered adequate. The fighting consumed it at rates requiring resupply before the island was secured. What the garrison consumed in conducting that defense was itself, and what the Americans consumed was measured in the 14,000 casualties the official count recorded, and in the particular kind of knowledge that an army acquires only in that specific form of close terrain fighting, which does not transfer from any training environment and does not accumulate except through the doing of it. Its commanding general died on the island. Admiral Nagumo died on the island. In the final days of the fighting, thousands of Japanese civilians on the northern cliffs of Saipan, unwilling to surrender to an enemy their government had told them would be merciless, threw themselves from the rock faces into the sea below. The American troops who had reached the northern end of the island watched from positions on the ground and could do nothing. The event entered the war's record as Marpy Point, a name that does not appear in most general histories, and that the men who were present spent years trying to describe accurately. At sea, during the same weeks, the Imperial Japanese Navy made its attempt at the decisive engagement its planning had been building toward. The Battle of the Philippine Sea on June 19th and 20th destroyed what remained of Japanese carrier aviation as a functional fighting force. The Japanese carrier pilots flew from their ships against the American task force and met a defensive fighter screen in numbers and quality that the Japanese training pipeline, already depleted by 3 years of attrition, could not match. American Hellcat pilots, trained at a tempo and with resources that no Japanese training program in its wartime condition could replicate, shot down more than 300 Japanese aircraft in 2 days of fighting that American pilots afterward described, with an honesty that had little room for celebration in it, as a turkey shoot. The experienced aviators who had flown from Japanese carriers at Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea in Midway were already gone. The men who flew in June 1944 had been produced by a shortened training pipeline, and the shortening was itself the accumulated product of everything Japan's air power had lost since Guadalcanal. What flew against the American carriers was what remained. The loss figures from the Philippine Sea were not merely tactical. The pilots Japan lost over those 2 days were the remaining core of a carrier aviation force that had been under sustained attrition since Midway. The D-4Y dive bombers and A-6M fighters and B-6N torpedo aircraft that went down in the Philippine Sea had been flown by men whom no training pipeline in Japan's wartime condition could replace on any schedule the war allowed. Aircraft were replaceable. Japan's factories, increasingly strained by American submarine operations against the merchant fleet carrying raw materials from the Southern Resources Zone, could still produce airframes. The pilots who understood how to use them were not being produced at the rate the losses required. In the post-war accounting, the Battle of the Philippine Sea is recorded as a tactical defeat. In the calculus of what Japan needed to continue fighting at all, it was closer to the end of a kind of capacity that had no recovery path. Tinian fell on August 1, 1944, after 8 days. Guam was secured on August 10th after 3 weeks of fighting whose cost and character resembled Saipan's. By mid-August, all 3 major islands were in American hands. The absolute national defense zone's inner ring had been entered. The line that Tojo had publicly guaranteed would hold had not held. He had already resigned. July 18th, his entire cabinet with him. The political mechanism inside Tokyo moved at the speed of a promise broken beyond any capacity for repair. The men who received his portfolio understood what the maps now showed, though the full weight of what the maps meant would not be measured until the aircraft began arriving on the runways being built on the flat plateau at the northern end of Tinian. Those runways were being built, while some parts of the island were still being cleared of Japanese holdouts by the Naval Mobile Construction Battalions. The Seabees, a name that came from the initials CB for Construction Battalion, were civilian construction trades in uniform. Before the war, they had been ironworkers and pipe fitters and electricians and carpenters and equipment operators. They had been issued rifles in addition to their tools and had been trained in the specific requirement that their work would often begin before the infantry finished. On Tinian, they went to work while the engineers were still marking boundaries on ground where men had died the previous week. Their task was to build airfields capable of sustaining B-29 operations. The aircraft weighed 60 tons fully loaded. It required a runway of 8,500 feet minimum to get airborne with a full war load. The equipment the Seabees brought ashore included the full range of American heavy construction machinery: bulldozers, motor graders, coral crushing plants that pulverized the island's surface material into usable base course, pneumatic rollers, generators, and the maintenance supplies to keep all of it running through tropical heat and rain and the occasional explosion from Japanese ordnance that Seabee crews hit while working ground that had been a battlefield. The post-war engineering records state that 15,000 Seabees worked in rotating shifts around the clock. They moved enough crushed coral to fill the volume of Hoover Dam 3 times over. What the official construction histories call the miracle of construction produced 4 parallel runways at Northfield, each 8,500 feet long, within roughly 60 days of the island's capture. Westfield added 2 more. By August of 1945, Northfield on Tinian was the largest airbase in the world by aircraft movement count. The ground it occupied had been sugarcane plantation and jungle 14 months before. The engineering problem the Seabees faced was not simply one of scale. The coral that underlaid Tinian's northern plateau was suitable for crushing into airfield base course, but required machinery calibrated for the specific material characteristics of Pacific coral, which differed from mainland aggregate in ways that affected compaction rates and the finished surface hardness the B-29's landing gear demanded. The runways had to be built to load-bearing specifications that no coral-based Pacific airfield had previously been required to meet. The depth of base course under the surface layer, the gradient of the drainage system, the positioning of the hardstands relative to the runway thresholds to allow aircraft to taxi without impeding departing traffic. All of it required on-site engineering decisions made in real time by officers and enlisted men who had not built anything of comparable scale before, and who were making those calculations while ground crews were still sweeping for Japanese ordnance in the adjacent fields. The B-29s began arriving in October 1944. The first aircraft, named Jolton Josie, touched down at Saipan on October 12 with Brigadier General Haywood Hansel himself at the controls. By late November, over 100 superfortresses were based in the Marianas. Each aircraft required a crew of 11, drawn from a training pipeline that had not existed at the necessary scale before December 1941. Each aircraft carried electronics and systems that pushed the manufacturing precision of American wartime industry. Each one was a node in a supply chain that extended from the factories in Wichita and Marietta and Omaha back through Pearl Harbor and then to the Marianas, with fuel and bombs and spare engines and food and medical supplies and replacement aircraft flowing forward along that chain at the rate the operational schedule required. Japan's assessment in September 1943 had calculated whether the Americans could project air power across Pacific distances. It had not fully calculated what the Americans had been building since Pearl Harbor for the specific purpose of making that projection work. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe and turn on notifications. There's far more in the record still to cover. Your support is what keeps these stories coming. The first combat mission from the Marianas lifted off on November 24, 1944. Brigadier General Emmett O'Donnell, flying in an aircraft named Dauntless Dottie, led 111 B-29s of the 73rd Bomb Wing north from Saipan's Isley Field across 1,400 miles of open ocean. The mission was designated San Antonio 1, and it was the first American bomber formation over Tokyo since the Doolittle raid of April 1942. The target was the Nakajima Aircraft Company's Musashi engine plant on the outskirts of Tokyo, a facility that the target analysts had identified as producing roughly 30% of the engines powering Japanese Army aircraft. In the precision bombing doctrine that governed the campaign, destroying the plant accurately and completely would remove a measurable fraction of Japanese fighter production at a moment when that production was already under pressure it could not easily absorb. The aircraft that flew that day were the product of 2.5 years of industrial and engineering effort aimed at making this specific mission possible. Their crews had trained in Kansas and Nebraska, flew by Starsight across empty Pacific distances, and arrived over Japan in strength sufficient to constitute a genuine air campaign. What the returns showed mattered accordingly. 17 aircraft turned back before reaching Japan with mechanical difficulties. Of those that continued, 88 reached Japan and released bombs. Of the 88, 24 struck the primary target. The remainder bombed secondary targets or returned with their loads because the primary was obscured. The post-war assessment team that examined the Nakajima plant found less than 4% reduction in productive capacity. The mission had sent 111 aircraft 1,400 miles and back and had accomplished, in the most direct measure, almost nothing. The plant was attacked again the following week. and again after that. The results were comparable, sometimes worse. The reason had nothing to do with the air crews or with the aircraft. It was atmospheric. Above Japan in winter, at the altitudes the XXI Bomber Command was flying, between 27 and 32,000 feet, the jet stream ran at velocities that the American Meteorological Service had not yet fully mapped in that region. The upper-level winds above the home islands could reach 200 miles per hour and regularly exceeded 150. A bomb released from an aircraft passing through a 200-mile-per-hour crosswind drifts through distances at which the Norden bombsight's calculations become irrelevant. The instrument was a precision optical device of genuine engineering merit. The physics of the jet stream negated it. The bombs that the bombardiers released with care and precision landed hundreds of feet or more from the aiming point, scattered by atmospheric conditions that the doctrine had not been written to account for, and that no modification to the bomb sight could correct. Cloud cover layered additional difficulty onto the wind problem. Japan in winter placed heavy overcast above the target areas on a substantial fraction of flying days that were otherwise usable. A mission that launched from Saipan in a clear Pacific sky could arrive over Tokyo to find the target invisible under a deck of cloud that extended across the entire bombing approach. Radar bombing through cloud degraded accuracy further than the jet stream alone had done. Some missions came home with full bomb loads because releasing ordnance blind over a target that could not be confirmed from any instrument in the aircraft was considered worse than the cost of the round trip. The crews who had flown 1,400 miles in each direction and turned back with their bombs accepted those missions as lost and flew the next one on the schedule. The precision daylight strategic bombing concept that governed the campaign had been built in the interwar years on the theory that a sufficiently trained crew with a sufficiently accurate bomb sight could place bombs on specific industrial facilities from high altitude and could do so with a precision that area bombing could not approach. The theory rested on conditions that Japan's winter weather and upper atmosphere did not reliably provide. The bomb damage assessments that returned from mission after mission through the winter of 1944 and in 1945 told the same story. Japanese aircraft engine production, ball bearing production, airframe, and assembly plants, the specific target categories that American target analysts had designated as war decisive, remained largely intact. The missions flew, and the crews returned, and the damage teams found, week after week, that the war industries of Japan were still producing at rates that the bombing campaign had not yet touched. Brigadier General Haywood Hansell commanded the 21st Bomber Command. He had been one of the principal architects of the precision bombing concept, a member of the team that wrote the 1941 air war plan against Germany and developed the industrial target priority systems that American strategic air planning had used as its framework through the war. His convictions about the doctrine were principled and not easily dislodged by evidence that contradicted them. He believed the problems were operational rather than doctrinal, that weather conditions would improve as the seasons turned, that crews would develop the experience and technique to operate more effectively under difficult conditions, that patience with the doctrine would eventually produce results that vindicated it. General Arnold was not disposed to wait. The $3 billion program and the blood that had been spent taking the Marianas had produced a bombing campaign whose results, measured honestly against the investment, could not be defended to the Joint Chiefs or to the President. Arnold visited the command's operations data personally in late January and found a set of numbers whose implications he had already drawn from the reports reaching Washington. In late January 1945, he relieved Hansell of command and gave the 21st Bomber Command to Major General Curtis LeMay. LeMay had commanded B-29 operations from China under Matterhorn and had been in the Marianas since August. He was 38 years old when he assumed the command, the youngest major general in the Army. The men who worked under him described an officer who derived conclusions from what the evidence showed rather than from what the doctrine predicted the evidence should show, who did not soften findings when they pointed toward decisions that were uncomfortable, and who ran meetings in which the gap between a briefer summary and the underlying data was unwelcome. He reviewed everything the command had produced since San Antonio 1. The mission reports, the bomb damage assessments, the weather records, the mechanical abort rates, which were running at over 20% on some missions, the loss figures, and then he examined maps of the cities where Japan's industrial capacity was actually located. What those maps showed was not the industrial geography of Germany, where large factory complexes sat at the edges of cities in configurations that precision bombing could attempt to address as discrete targets. Japanese war production was dispersed through neighborhoods. The workshops and small factories that produced components and subassemblies were woven into the residential fabric of Tokyo and Nagoya and Osaka and Kobe, in buildings that from 30,000 feet were indistinguishable from the houses surrounding them. The cities were built largely of wood and paper construction on dense street grids, with almost no open ground between structures that could serve as natural fire breaks. The M69 incendiary submunition, a 6-pound device that American engineers had tested against constructed mock-ups of Japanese residential and industrial building types at the Dugway Proving Ground in Utah before the war, had been stockpiled in the Marianas in quantities large enough to be operationally useful. The Dugway tests had been conducted in 1943 against structures built to accurate dimensions and material specifications for Japanese urban residential and commercial construction. The results showed ignition characteristics that differed substantially from what incendiaries produced against European brick and masonry construction, and those results have been filed in the target planning offices of the Army Air Forces without being incorporated into the active campaign's ordnance selection. It had not been authorized for use in the area attack quantities that would be required to burn the production capacity out of the neighborhoods where it was embedded. LeMay got the authorization. What he proposed, and what General Arnold approved from Washington, reversed the operational method the campaign had been using since its beginning. Before ordering the first incendiary mission, LeMay worked through the specific variables the change in approach would require. Flying at night removed the advantage that the precision doctrine's Norden-equipped bombardiers provided, but the precision doctrine had already demonstrated it was producing no usable advantage at those altitudes under those conditions. A bomber stream at 5,000 to 9,000 feet would present itself to Japanese anti-aircraft artillery at ranges where flak would be more concentrated than at 30,000 feet, but darkness removed the advantage that daytime visual tracking gave the gun crews. The Japanese gun positions defending Tokyo had been mapped from reconnaissance photography accumulated over months. LeMay calculated the balance of those variables and concluded the loss rates at low altitude at night would likely run lower than what the command had been accepting at high altitude in daylight. Against targets, it was failing to damage. The B-29s would fly at night. They would fly low. They would fly at low altitude, between 5,000 and 9,000 feet, rather than the 27 to 32,000 feet the precision bombing doctrine prescribed. The defensive gun positions and most of the ammunition would be stripped from the aircraft to allow heavier bomb loads. The M69 incendiary clusters would replace the precision high-explosive ordnance. The missions would fly without fighter escort, on the calculation that Japanese night interception capability at low altitude was less organized and less effective than Japanese day fighters had been against high-altitude formations in daylight. LeMay briefed his crews on the plan and told them what the risk estimates showed. Some of his senior staff told him the loss rates would be unacceptable at those altitudes. He ordered the first mission and waited for what the returns would say. On the evening of March 9th, 1945, more than 300 B-29s began lifting from runways at Guam, Saipan, and Tinian at 50-second intervals. The aircraft flew north in darkness, tracking by the stars and by the radio aids that American engineering had positioned across the Pacific. The lead aircraft reached the Japanese coast before midnight, local time. The target area designated for the attack was a 3-by-4-mile section of the Shitamachi district in Tokyo's eastern wards, a zone that American intelligence had assessed as housing approximately 750,000 people in wood-frame structures interspersed with the small workshops and component factories that made up Japan's cottage industrial production capacity. The incendiaries fell across the district in successive waves as the bomber stream passed over. The men in the aircraft experienced the approach under conditions unlike the high-altitude precision missions that had constituted every previous operation from the Marianas. At 7,000 feet, the crews could see the ground with a clarity that 30,000 feet had never permitted. Tokyo's grid was visible below them, its streetlights still burning when the lead aircraft reached the coast. Anti-aircraft fire came up at ranges closer than anything the previous missions had encountered, close enough that fragments struck fuselages and the orange flash of proximity bursts was visible through cockpit glass. The thermal columns from the fire's the first wave ignited rose into the altitude band where the second and third waves were flying, severe enough to throw aircraft out of control flight, severe enough that crew members reported it as the most disorienting flying of their Pacific service. The navigators whose bomb runs crossed the burning zones below reported cockpit temperatures the heating systems could not account for. The fires that started in the first minutes of the attack spread into surrounding blocks faster than the Tokyo civil defense apparatus could register them, let alone respond. The wind that night was a moderate northwesterly, ordinary March weather by any local standard. In combination with the density of the burning structures and the scale of the ignition the first waves had produced, the wind drove fire through the neighborhood grids at a rate that eliminated any meaningful distinction between a fire that could be fought and one that could not. The Tokyo Fire Department deployed everything it had. The fire breaks that had been cut through parts of the city in years of anticipatory preparation proved insufficient for a fire that overwhelmed the blocks on both sides of them before the fire engines could position. Water supplies in some districts failed under the demand. The river and canals in the eastern wards concentrated civilians who had run toward water, as the ancient response to urban fire commanded. The fires closed around those waterways, and the heat above them rose past what survival allowed. 15.8 square miles of Tokyo were destroyed. The post-war survey teams estimated 90,000 to 100,000 deaths in the raid and its immediate aftermath, though some careful analyses placed the figure higher. Over 1 million people were left without shelter in a city that had not yet recovered from the shock of understanding what had happened. 14 B-29s were lost from the attacking force, a loss rate lower than the high-altitude daylight missions had sustained against targets they had barely scratched. LeMay ordered Nagoya attacked on March 11th, Osaka on March 13th, Kobe on March 16th, Nagoya again on March 18th. The cities were not random selections from map. Nagoya housed the Mitsubishi aircraft engine and airframe facilities that had continued producing through the winter's failed precision raids. Osaka held concentrations of chemical, steel, and naval construction industries that American target analysts had ranked near the top of the priority list since before the first Marianas mission. Kobe was the port handling the largest share of shipping through which imported raw materials reached the inland manufacturing base. What the incendiary attacks achieved against those specific industries was not precision in the doctrinal sense. The workshops inside the burn zones ceased to function not because a specific facility had been accurately struck, but because the neighborhood fabric in which they were embedded had been consumed. The effect on production was indistinguishable from a direct hit. The survey teams that entered those cities after the surrender found not damaged factories awaiting repair, but the absence of the structures in which production had been occurring. In 10 days, more than 30 square miles of Japan's most important industrial and urban areas burned. The campaign paused only when the incendiary stocks had been drawn down to minimum reserve levels. The resupply ships from Pearl Harbor brought more. The missions resumed. The Japanese air defense system that met those raids in the spring of 1945 had been designed for a different kind of threat. Night interception at low altitude required radar-equipped fighters, ground control systems calibrated for the task, and extensive training in the techniques that made finding and engaging an aircraft in darkness at 5,000 feet different from everything that high-altitude day interception had required. Japan had some of each of these. It did not have enough of any of them to impose loss rates that would slow 300 B-29s arriving in successive waves, and the commanders reviewing the returns from each mission understood what the numbers showed. The anti-aircraft fire over some target areas was heavy and did account for aircraft. It was not heavy enough and not accurate enough in the dark to constitute a defense in the operational sense. Between March and August 1945, the 21st Bomber Command flew more than 400 combat missions against Japan. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey teams that entered Japan in the weeks following the surrender walked through the results in 67 cities that the survey rated as having suffered major destruction. The industrial capacity of the home islands had been reduced not primarily by the precision attacks on specific facilities, which the survey's damage assessment showed had largely failed to achieve their objectives, but by the area incendiary campaign that had burned the dispersed production base out of the urban fabric it was woven through. Steel output, aircraft engine production, chemical production, naval construction, Almost every measure of Japanese war industry output that the survey examined showed collapse in the spring and summer of 1945 at rates that no targeted precision attack against specific facilities had approached. The survey found something in the Japanese record that the American commanders had not expected to find stated so plainly. Senior government and military officials had concluded by the spring of 1945 that the war could not be won. The assessments reaching the highest levels of the Tokyo government were explicit about what the combination of the air campaign, the naval blockade cutting off raw material imports, and the loss of the forward island positions had done to Japan's capacity to continue fighting at any level that made continued resistance rational. The men advising the emperor were calculating the cost of an invasion of the home islands and finding numbers that, whatever the military culture demanded of them, the strategic situation could not sustain. Fleet Admiral Soma Toyoda, who had commanded the combined fleet through the last years of the war, told his post-war interrogators that he had understood Japan's position was not recoverable from the moment Saipan fell. He said that the loss of the Marianas demonstrated that the inner ring had been breached, and that once breached, the logic of the war had shifted permanently in the American direction. He had not known with precision what would come from those islands. He had known that whatever came could not be stopped. The 2 atomic bombs that ended the war in August 1945 were delivered by B-29s from the Runways the Seabees had built on Tinian. The Enola Gay departed North Field on August 6th. Boxcar departed on August 9th. Both aircraft lifted from concrete that had been sugarcane plantation less than 14 months before they carried the weapons that closed the war. The weapons are discussed in most histories as events of their own significance. The platform that delivered them, and the chain of battles and decisions and engineering labor that placed that platform on those runways, was the same chain that had been running since the autumn of 1943, when the Americans had decided that the geography they needed was inside the absolute national defense zone and had set in motion everything required to take it. What Japan's planners had believed in September of that year was that the Pacific worked in their favor. Distance was the most reliable weapon in their inventory. The ocean between the Marianas and the American continent was not a space to be crossed, but a barrier whose scale exceeded any logistics system the Americans could build far enough forward to matter. The belief was not irrational, given the evidence available in September 1943. The Pacific was very wide. The Japanese island garrisons were real, fortified, and prepared. The logistical demands of projecting strategic air power at 1,400 miles of open ocean from a forward base were genuine and had not yet been demonstrated to be solvable at the scale required. The belief failed because it assessed what was possible for a country that had not been building the Pacific logistics system since December 8, 1941, and applied that assessment to a country that had been building it continuously, at every scale and speed that American industrial production made available, for more than 2 years. The Seabees who built the Tinian runways in 60 days were construction workers from Ohio and Minnesota and Louisiana, men who had been equipment operators and concrete finishers and pipe fitters before the war. The crews who flew north in the dark of March 9th were farm boys and mechanics, and accounting students from the full breadth of a continental nation whose wartime mobilization had absorbed them and trained them, and put them in a pressurized aircraft over the Pacific with 11 other men who depended on each of the others. The admirals and generals who planned the Marianas campaign had spent their pre-war careers in a peacetime military that would not have recognized the force it became. None of them, separately, was what the absolute national defense zone's assumptions had failed to account for. Together, they were. At North Field on Tinian, today the geometry of the airbase survives in the ground. Satellite imagery shows the runway outlines with a clarity that the decades since 1945 have not erased. Northfield's layout was not the only geometry the Seabees imposed on Tinian that the island has carried forward into the post-war world. The road network built to connect the dispersed hardstand areas to the runway system. The drainage channels preventing the surface flooding that Coral Bay's course is vulnerable to in tropical rain. The orientation of the runways themselves, set to the prevailing wind patterns that meteorological teams had recorded through the construction phase. All of it was engineering work done in the summer of 1944 by men who knew the work was necessary and knew the reason it was necessary, without knowing the full form the missions north would eventually take. The Enola Gay's crew were briefed on their specific mission hours before departure. The men who poured the concrete under the runway had been briefed only that B-29s were coming, and that the runway had to be ready when they arrived. Both were necessary for what happened on August 6th. The chain ran from one to the other through the months between. At ground level, you can walk sections of the original concrete, find the hardstand outlines where the aircraft sat before their missions north, stand at the threshold of runway Able, where the Enola Gay reached rotation speed before dawn on August 6th. The jungle has moved back across some of what the Seabees cleared. The island is quiet now in a way it was not between October 1944 and August 1945, when the runways were carrying more aircraft movement than any airfield in the world, and the B-29s were climbing out of those runways in the dark toward Japan. The staff officer who wrote, inside Imperial General Headquarters in the autumn of 1943, that American air power would remain operationally irrelevant as long as Japan held the islands at the appropriate distances, was doing what his position and his information required. He assessed the situation as it existed at that moment. He derived a conclusion from it. The conclusion was correct for the situation as it existed. The situation changed because a country had decided to change it and had the industrial and military machinery to follow through on that decision at a rate and a scale that no assessment written in September 1943 had been built to account for. The thing that Prime Minister Tojo had publicly guaranteed would never happen was the thing that the Seabees and the B-29 crews and the sailors and the Marines and the soldiers and the logisticians and the engineers were in the process of making permanent while Tojo still held office. He resigned before the implications of what had been built on those islands were fully visible. The men who built it, and the men who flew from it, carried the story in a form that no post-war revision has been able to substantially alter. The B-29s that flew north in the dark of March 1945 were flying toward Japan that the absolute national defense zone had been designed to protect. The zone had been breached. The protection was gone. The aircraft climbing from the coral runways that the Seabees had built where sugarcane had grown were the evidence that it was gone, and they were going north to complete what the breach had made possible. Thank you for staying with us until the end. If what you heard here stayed with you, the other films on your screen carry the story forward. Subscribe if you haven't, and I'll see you in the next one.